Thank you very much, Chair, colleagues. It gives me a great deal of pleasure to be here representing Professor John Waterlow. He has written a statement which I would like to read, and I have some visuals to go with it. The statement starts, "I am very sorry that I cannot be here in person, but I am 93 years old and not fit to travel, so my friend and colleague, Alan Jackson, will speak for me. I am truly grateful to the University of Navarra for awarding this prize to the Tropical Metabolism Research Unit, TMRU for short, in Jamaica. This island was discovered by Columbus in 1494 and occupied by Spain in 1509, until it was captured by the British in 1655. Jamaica, therefore, has a tenuous link with your country, although, as far as I know, nothing of the Spanish time remains except the name of the former capital, Spanish Town. I want first to give you some account of how the TMRU came into existence, a research organization several thousand miles away from its parent body, the Medical Research Council in London. This account will involve me in saying something about my own career and development, and I apologize if this seems egotistical. I qualified in medicine in 1942, in the middle of the Second World War, having specialized in physiology at Cambridge University. I was immediately put to work on the effects of heat stress in soldiers. This involved me spending the best part of a year in Basra, Iraq. An army of about 1 million men, British and Indian, had been assembled there to counter the threat of the Germans breaking through the Caucasus and seizing the oil fields. That was no longer a problem after the Russian victory at Stalingrad in 1943, but when I arrived in Basra, there was still a very large army there looking after the supply lines to Russia. My immediate boss in this work was B.S. Platt, who in peacetime was director of the Human Nutrition Research Unit. And as the war drew to an end, he said to me, "The biggest problem in the future is going to be nutrition." I knew nothing of nutrition, but looked on it as a branch of physiology, as I still do. But this seemed to me to be good sense, and I agreed to join Platt's unit. Almost immediately, I was sent out to the British Caribbean to investigate why so many infants were dying. The British Caribbean consisted of a number of islands, of which the biggest are Jamaica and Trinidad, with 2 mainland territories, British Guiana in South America and Honduras in Central America. In 1945, they were all colonies administered from London, but became independent in the 1960s. It had always seemed remarkable to me that during a war that stretched our effort to the limit, administrators in London should concern themselves with child deaths several thousand miles away. I first visited Trinidad, then Guyana, and finally Jamaica, working in the hospitals, visiting clinics, and checking records. It soon became clear that the official causes of death, puny from birth, nephrosis, worms, and so on, were nonsense, and that the main cause was malnutrition. But malnutrition of a special kind, categorized by massive edema and enormous enlargement of the liver. I found at autopsy and by biopsy, which I carried out with great trepidation, using a veterinary needle, that these livers were nothing but a mass of fat, and I called the condition fatty liver disease. Later, when I got back to England and looked at the literature, I found that this condition had been described 10 years earlier in West Africa and given the local name kwashiorkor, and also in various countries in Latin America, where it was called dystrophia polykyrinciale. In both regions, a nutritional cause was suggested. My time in Jamaica coincided with a visit by a commission sent out from the UK to plan the foundation of a new university and medical school in Jamaica to serve the whole British Caribbean. I was so much impressed by the caliber of the West Indian members of the Commission that I decided to make my future career in this new school. That took 5 years to come about. I applied for, but failed to get the professorship of physiology, but eventually an arrangement was made for me to be a part-time lecturer in physiology and part-time to continue my research for the Medical Research Council in the UK. That was a turning point for me, which laid the foundation of the TMRU, but it could easily have turned out differently. When I was in Guyana before going to Jamaica, the governor sent me to look at the nutritional state of the Uauy Indians, who live in the forests and mountains that border on Venezuela. When I got back, he read my report and immediately said, "I would like to offer you a job, the job of Director of Aboriginal Medical Services." After much hesitation, I turned it down because although my wife and I would have liked a life far away from civilization, I realized that it would involve a lot of obstetrics, and my knowledge and experience in that subject were virtually nil, my training in it having been at a hospital in the East End of London at the height of the 1940 Blitz. So my future was to be in Jamaica rather than Guyana. By 1950, the medical school in Jamaica had got going, and my family and I arrived there at the end of that year, coinciding with a severe hurricane. I was allotted a laboratory, a wooden hut, part of a camp set up during the war for refugees from Gibraltar. I wanted to find out what was going wrong in the fatty livers of these malnourished infants. At that time, there was a great deal of interest in the USA in enzyme changes in tissues in experimental animals under various nutritional conditions. While waiting to go to Jamaica, I had spent a lot of time constructing apparatus for making measurements of various enzymes in very small amounts of tissue that one could get in human biopsies. A microrespirometer, 1,000 times more sensitive than the conventional Warburg apparatus known as the Cartesian diver, had been developed in the Carlsberg laboratory in Copenhagen, primarily for measuring the respiration of amoeba. I constructed and tested this apparatus, modifying it for use on tissue homogenates, and measured various enzymes in the malnourished livers. Nothing much of interest came of this, except that there was a defect in oxidative phosphorylation in the fatty livers, which could be very important, but could also be an artifact caused by fat in the homogenates. At that time I believed, and still believe, that a major cause of this syndrome of edema and fatty liver was dietary protein deficiency. But how to prove it? It had been shown in rats that a low-protein diet had no effect on the total DNA content of the liver, but only a reduction of cytoplasmic protein, so that the nitrogen to DNA ratio fell. I was able to show that there was a substantial fall in this ratio in the malnourished livers, so that whether or not dietary protein deficiency was the cause, the result was protein depletion. Nowadays, such investigative biopsies on children would almost certainly be considered unethical. I can only say, first, that in many hundreds of biopsies, I never had any mishap. Secondly, that the mortality in these children was high. It was justified to try and find out as much as possible about the cause. John's wife, Angela, was a gifted artist, and she painted many murals around the university, and this is one in the medical school at the outside the Dean's office at the University of the West Indies, showing the parable of the Good Samaritan. After 3 years in Jamaica, I concluded that I couldn't make much progress in understanding the pathophysiology of edematous malnutrition working on my own with one technician. So I suggested to the Medical Research Council in London that they should establish a small unit in Jamaica. This was agreed. The unit was to have initially a staff of 4 scientists and would be called the Tropical Metabolism Research Unit, because it might become concerned with problems other than malnutrition and would have its own ward and laboratories operating as a part of the Faculty of Medicine of the universities. One of the first problems was the mechanism for edema. Low plasma albumin was an obvious causal factor, but probably not the only one. The work of Gamble and Darrow in the USA and Hansen in South Africa had shown the importance of potassium in the treatment of dehydrated children with diarrhea. We found a low potassium to nitrogen ratio in the muscle in our children, and in order to avoid invasive muscle biopsy, we got a prototype infant whole body counter from the Packard company in the United States of America for counting whole body potassium, and a massive donation of low radiation lead to shield it from Australia. Work with this showed a substantial loss of body potassium in our infants. I was further convinced of the importance of potassium loss in causing edema by an experience on an expedition to the Colombian Andes to investigate the cause of mountain sickness. I was on a low potassium diet and became grossly edematous and semi-conscious, effects which instantly disappeared when I took supplementary potassium. This slide shows the effect of the giving potassium, those early studies, and the significant reduction in mortality when that was recognized. John Waterlow was very fond of making his own instruments, and this is a steam-driven centrifuge which was specially designed to take up the Andes to centrifuge the blood samples that they took to investigate the low potassium status. And that's in the museum in Jamaica. In spite of all our efforts, about 25% of our babies died, a rate similar to that found in pediatric centers all over the developing world. If, as was generally thought, protein deficiency was the main cause, it was logical to treat it with a high-protein diet. We argued that if there was a depletion of body protein, this might involve loss of the protein machinery for synthesizing protein and be irreversible, and an excess of amino acids that could not be utilized might well be toxic. To test this hypothesis required measurements of whole-body protein synthesis. The way we did that was to give the stable isotope 15-nitrogen in an amino acid glycine and to measure the excretion of isotope in urinary urea and ammonia. These measurements were made with an early model isotope ratio mass spectrometer given to us by the Wellcome Trust. Some people thought it was absurd to give such a complex instrument for work in a third world country such as Jamaica. But in the event, work in the TMRU did show that whole body synthesis was reduced in malnourished children, the mortality of the children in TMRU was greatly reduced, and a recommendation by Dr. Picou, who succeeded me as director, for a low protein diet in the early stages of treatment was included in a manual of the World Health Organization on the treatment of protein energy malnutrition in 1980. These are two examples of the work of the TMRU, although I am myself a string and sealing wax man. It was clear that in this age, in order to be scientifically competitive, one has to have up-to-date instruments. And the unit staff were very active in going into the workshop and making their own instrumentations. Here's a microbalance made by John Garrow to measure small samples. Dealing with up-to-date instruments in Jamaica is possible, but such work does have its impediments, and these impediments were not intellectual, but only practical, for example, large voltage fluctuations. On a different line, it became clear that the TMRU should not be just an outlying British research unit, but that it should become part of the community contributing to the scientific developments in the Caribbean. From the first, we took graduate students of the university to work for higher degrees. Later, 2 West Indians, shown in this slide, were appointed as full members of the scientific staff. If nothing else, this was important for the continuity of the unit because few British staff were willing to stay for more than 2 or 3 years. One of the 2 West Indians, on the left, second from the left, David Picou from Trinidad, succeeded me as the director. The other, on the extreme left, Georgia Lane, joined the Pan American Health Organization, the Western Hemisphere branch of the World Health Organization, and in due course became its director, and was very nearly appointed Director General of the World Health Organization. it was becoming gradually apparent that the TMRU should be a West Indian rather than a British unit, and the university gladly and generously took over from London the responsibility for the unit's administration and financing. This transfer was finalised in 1972, and I returned to England to a chair in the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. This is the early story of the TMRU, and John has asked me to say a few words about the later stages when I succeeded David Piku as director. The early manual from the WHO, World Health Organization, was later revised, and this is the current advice on how to manage severe malnutrition in childhood, using evidence-based for rational interventions. Importantly, the interventions have extended to a consideration not simply of the physical well-being of the children, but also their mental well-being and the importance of appropriate play therapy or stimulation in achieving that in children whose bodies have been ravaged. Dr. Sally Grantham McGregor has played a lead role in this activity, going into the most impoverished communities around the world, where 200 million children are estimated to have their future blighted through poor physical and mental development. The basic information generated from the work in the TMRU has gone on to save many thousands of lives in starvation, in famine situations and other emergencies, and this is just one example of the evidence base as to how that works. And this is taken from Somalia refugee camp during the famine in 92 to 93, where the mortality from malnutrition without edema was 20%, and for malnutrition with edema was 37%. The standard approach was to treat these individuals with a relatively high protein diet, and colleagues from the unit advised that it was maybe more appropriate to use a low protein diet, particularly in the early circumstances. And what you can see here, that when the individuals were fed on a low protein diet, the mortality rate was halved from 52% to 27% in those with edema, and from 22 to 13% in those without edema. Those on the low protein diet achieved their appetite return much more quickly, and their edema was lost, reinforcing that the same principles that applied to the severely malnourished children also apply to individuals at any age when they're faced with the stress and challenge of severe malnutrition. A few years ago, we celebrated the 50th anniversary of the Tropical Metabolism Research Unit, and this book was produced with the caption, "The House That John Built," a term chosen by Professor Sir George Elaine. And these murals that I've shown you before and is shown on the front of this book depicts a marketplace, and these are murals that are on the walls of the foyer of the Tropical Metabolism Research Unit. And we like to think that the TMRU marketplace, like other marketplaces, is a place for exchange, but a place for exchange of knowledge and ideas. And from this space, within the region, has been the development of clinical epidemiology and the wider application of the understanding from clinical investigation to public health. Within the unit, that has played a formative role in better understanding the underlying basis of the life course of chronic non-communicable disease, and contributed to the Barker hypothesis, or the fetal origins of adult disease, in terms of the evidence base for that. Perhaps the most telling benefit of having a research unit in a developing country, where the people from the country have the opportunity to learn to solve their own problems, is the fact that Jamaica, without having any special attributes, is in the top 5 around the world for achieving health development, social and economic developments at least cost. So Jamaica has best health indices at least cost, one of the top 5 in the country. And there's no doubt in my mind that the intellectual stimulus and drive provided by John Waterlow and his colleagues played a very important part in achieving that health at low cost. After John retired, there was a Festschrift for him, and this is a photograph who participated in the Festschrift at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And you can see that amongst those who are present at that Festschrift are a range of some of the most senior leaders in nutrition around the world, not simply from the United Kingdom, but from all around the world, and particularly all around Europe. And so within that Festschrift, the book of the Festschrift catalogues and captures the experience of those who have been influenced and had the benefit of working with John and benefiting from his experience. And so I would like to offer you John Waterlow as a giant, as a man of science, who always conducted his science with humility and grace, and was particularly generous to young people who had the privilege to continue his legacy. John has always taken a delight in communicating the joy and excitement of science and creating an environment in which young people could readily flourish. He never pretended that research was easy, but he was clear that the effort and discipline involved in identifying a difficult problem, working hard to resolve it for the greater benefit of humankind, was one of the greatest pleasures that could be enjoyed. Thank you very much.